Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Museum of Scotland. My name is Stephen Allen, and I'm Head of Learning and Programmes here. So it's my role to welcome you tonight on behalf of, and indeed to, the National Museum. And we're delighted to be continuing to work and hosting this in partnership with the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, who've organised tonight's fascinating event. First thing I do is a bit of housekeeping, which is if there is an emergency and we're asked to leave the building, of which none is planned, a very, very loud alarm will sound, and you're to follow the exit signs, and members of staff will escort you out of the museum, but nothing's planned. The toilets are back as the way you came in, back towards the entrance and on the left. And please a reminder to turn all mobile phones or devices either off or to silent. So tonight's event has the not unambitious title of 6,000 Years of Architecture, Innovation and Design, all to be achieved in the next hour or so, and with just 3 speakers. So ambition really is at the core of tonight. This forms part of the much wider series of events across Scotland and here at the museum, which link to the Year of Innovation, Architecture and Design, as well as the Festival of Architecture. And so events that the museum is organising at the moment include, we currently have a very, very popular Lego display and programmes for families, for young visitors to really to try building and design for themselves and architecture. Starting from April, we have a series of Architects in Conversation talks. So some very high-profile architects will be talking about their work, and we're grateful for Festival of Architecture for the support for that. And keep your eye on our website and our leaflets for our events. But I will also mention that in summer we will be opening, sort of in a way, the highlight of the year for us is the opening of 10 new science and technology and fashion, art and design galleries. And we'll be announcing that very shortly, but we'll be opening that in summer, which is very fittingly in the 150th anniversary of this museum, which was originally founded or originally opened as the Edinburgh Museum of Science and Art. So we'd love to pretend the whole thing was brilliantly designed to pull together to celebrate architecture, innovation, design, but most of it was. I'd just also take an opportunity to flag up a special event this time next Monday at 7 o'clock, which I know will be of interest to members of the Society. In partnership with the National Theatre of Scotland and as part of the running of the James plays at the Festival Theatre, we are hosting a discussion between the director and writer of the play and also National Museum of Scotland's own keeper of science of Scottish history and archaeology, George Dalgleish, and the principal curator, David Forsyth, talking about the making of the plays and the formation of the story of the James. Tickets are still on sale via our website, so I know it's just been advertised recently and tickets are going very quickly, but I know they would be of interest to people here and also of members. However, without further delay, I'm going to hand over to tonight's chair, who'll introduce tonight's event, will also explain the complex voting arrangements, colour-coded, and will outline the contributors in more detail. So Karen Forbes is very apt that Karen is speaking for tonight. She's Professor of Art at the University of Edinburgh's College of Art. She has a background and great experience in both art and architecture. So she really is ideally suited to explore the interface between art, design and architecture. Karen, thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to this joint event between the Society of Antiquaries and the National Museum of Scotland. The Society of Antiquaries is the senior antiquarian body in Scotland, and it has an important role in the cultural life and heritage of the country. Its connections with the National Museum of Scotland go back to its founding collections, which the Society gifted to the nation. Later, the Museum of Antiquities merged with the Royal Museum to form the National Museum of Scotland. This evening is a celebration of both of these formal connections and of the spirit of inquiry and investigation which is at the root of these collections. 6,000 years. That was the scope of the question we were given to represent this evening. The sheer spread of time is difficult to grasp. Whether when you think of relatively short durations of decades, you can perhaps picture the worn stone treads of the Playfair Steps in Edinburgh, installed in 1828, the most felicitous route through the city, illustrated by the habitual worn passage of thousands of feet. Or time illustrated by a past, present, future trilogy of the fourth crossing as railway bridge, road bridge, and the current new bridge under construction, a potent mixture of utility, engineering, essential infrastructure, and symbolism. But if we increase the scale of our considerations back into much deeper geological time, to the formation of our land and its terrain, the image becomes more opaque and unreadable. We understand how certain features of our landscape were created: the ancient volcano at the core of the city, the crag and tail formation of Castle Rock, and the Royal Mile at the heart of Edinburgh, carved out by glaciation, for example. But our appreciation of the timelines involved are imprecise. We can see that some landscapes offered key advantages to our ancestors. Historic topographical features offered security or energy or resources. The choice of dwelling places and optimum sites for religious, social, and political purposes were carefully selected within the continuous timeline of habitation. It is clear that the idea of practical innovation was always present in many different forms. Invention played a key role in generating better and more advantageous designs. With this in mind, we can appreciate the challenge which lies at the center of this evening's presentations. I'm joined by 3 experts who will each propose their perspective and arguments for your consideration. These speakers have been asked to choose their 3 key examples of architectural innovation and design which significantly changed the face of Scotland. This, of course, is an impossible task, but one which our guest speakers this evening have each taken on in the spirit of an intellectual challenge. I'm delighted to welcome this evening our specialists. Dr. Tanja Romankiewicz of the University of Edinburgh will present for Prehistory, spanning from the arrival of farming to 600 AD. Professor Richard Oram of the University of Stirling will select from the medieval period, ranging from 600 AD to the Union of the Crowns. And John Lowrey, also from the University of Edinburgh, will present for the modern era. Each speaker has been invited to make a personal selection. However, we hope you will also become an active participant in this debate. There will be time for questions after the presentations, and you will also have 3 cards relating to the 3 different historic periods. I'll just hold them up now. This one for prehistory, this one for 600 AD to the Union of the Crowns, and the yellow one for the modern era. And I will invite you later on to vote before the close of these proceedings. I ask you now to welcome our first speaker, Dr. Tanja Romankiewicz.
Yes, good evening, everybody. Can you all hear me okay at this level? Yeah, 6,000 years of architecture. Well, it's fair to say that the 3 of us didn't find it easy to pick our 3 choices. But I would like to remind you and my colleagues over there that they only had a few hundred years to choose from each, 1,416 between the 2 of them, whereas I just had 4,500 years to choose from. And actually, it is more than 9,000 years that I have chosen from, without giving too much away at this point. But I found this quite difficult because there are so many stunning buildings, structures to choose from. And unbelievable sometimes that people so many thousand years ago mastered the challenges of erecting more than 40 stones at Brodgar or built Neolithic cathedrals at the Ness nearby. Thus, kind of how to choose between all these examples that you can see there on the screen, and many of them photographed by you in the Society's recent Dig Art competition last year. And dealing with prehistory myself, I have also no architects to name, no idea how the people who built this called it, and I have no design statement to go with. But this is the basis of my research. I study the buildings these people left behind to understand the people that built them and get as close to their ideas as I can. And although I trained as an architect, and I should think of architecture as the art or science of building edifices of any kind for human use, the prehistoric builders have taught me other definitions, that buildings for human use are never finished, and that architecture is more a process, adjusting to the life that it has to shelter. And even iconic modern buildings, I would argue, are constantly transformed by unplanned events during construction or by the use by us. And as an archaeologist, which I am also, I read these kind of deliberate and fortuitous processes, and rarely from complete buildings, but from pits and post holes and few structural remains. And I realized when putting this together that mine may be a different perspective from yours, and that many of you will be surprised that I haven't chosen any of those examples that you've just seen. But that's also because I took my task that Karen outlined, I took that task quite literally, not to pick iconic buildings, but architectural innovations that changed the face of Scotland forever. So let's see what I chose. Well, having said that I wasn't going to pick iconic buildings, Scottish prehistory, of course, has its own iconic item. And those of you who know me are probably not surprised that I'll start with my beloved brochs. Those towers of the Scottish Iron Age, so well exampled by Musa on Shetland. However, it is not actually Musa that I want to pick, but the innovation behind these 13-meter tall dry stone towers built completely without mortar. And this innovation started much more humbly, hidden away in an Orcadian dry stone wall. Thus, my first architectural innovation is connected with this wall section at Boo in Orkney, because nothing better shows desperation and determination. Determination to build tall, and desperation to do it with an unsuitable wall construction, because those two thin wall faces couldn't contain the uncompacted core and kept collapsing. And only when the people who built this realized that what they needed were kind of well-layered courses throughout the wall, that's when they succeeded. And that's what made Musa possible and stand up to the present day. And I was able to trace this development, this innovation, to Piero Wall on Westray. But tomorrow, somebody might find a wall just like this in the Western Isles, and this might even predate the 600 BC. So I cannot claim this innovation for Orkney, but I'm convinced that it happened in a region where people were used to building in stone without mortar for more than 2,000 years. And the example that I want to pick to show the complex constructions of brochs is this one. Rhy Roy, here reconstructed, overlooking the shores of Loch Broom, just south of Ullapool. It looks just as tall as Musa. But when you're approaching closer, you realized that you'd been fooled by a very clever piece of architectural design, using the topography to its full advantage. The thrifty broch builders at Rhy Roy used the cliff face to make their broch look as tall as Musa, but with far less effort. And my research suggests that this is a recurrent feature with these structures, which contradicts hypotheses that always argue that broch builders aimed at building taller. My interpretation is that they wanted to achieve a certain design, a certain elevation, something that's recognizable, that creates an association which people wanted to be part of. Perhaps notions of strength or agricultural success that allowed the expenditure of a broch. And that seems to have worked even if you were only building half the height of a broch. But then your neighbor would know that half of your broch is glacial surface, and they would not be impressed. Thus, I think it's less kind of this local competition of who builds the tallest, but more showing off to those people down in Loch Broom in the boat. And the brochs show something else, that the idea of living in a round house is something bigger, and something that Scotland shares with England and Wales and Ireland throughout later prehistory, albeit mostly built in timber. Thus, is the round house a Scottish invention? It's more a question of semantics than architecture, because a round house, meaning a domestic building, we can only confirm from about the Bronze Age in Scotland. But this circular structure here, this round dish you see with the big post holes excavated, this was found in Dunbar in East Lothian, and it's of Mesolithic date. A circular structure with posts too big to carry on hunter-gatherer exploits just to set up camp. And a similar building was recently found in South Queensferry as well. And these are much more substantial structures than the stake-built ones we know, for example, from Mount Sandal in Northern Ireland. Thus, is this the earliest form of permanent architecture in Scotland at around 8,000 BC? But whether these Scottish examples were houses, this we cannot be sure. And we also cannot claim this innovation solely for Scotland, because a similar structure has appeared in Northumberland, near Howick. But since then, the circular shape has never really disappeared. And by around 1500 BC, the Middle Bronze Age, Scotland seems littered with roundhouses, just like these. But this particular one over there on the left, from Kintore in Aberdeenshire, has something more to tell. A very different concept of architecture, and readable not from impressive walls, but from small features, pits and post holes, and wear pattern, created by repeated walking and brushing and keeping animals inside. And tracing these kind of little features, I realized that these cannot be accommodated within the circle of that particular roundhouse. Thus, the outer wall must have been more malleable, responding to activities and energies created inside. And perhaps similar to later black houses, they would have also taken down part of the wall to let the beasts out. But contrary to the black houses, the Middle Bronze Age roundhouses were not rebuilt on the same footprint. Its architecture shifts and changes with these activities and energies, and into something that's less rigidly circular. So we may be surer that this is a house, but less so that it was always round. And even on abandonment, the house keeps transforming. My research suggests that houses were first used for human use, and then for cattle, and enriched with nutrients, they turned into gardens, similar maybe to the Shetland planticrew. So was this still a house or even architecture at this stage? But the house spot marked by this fertility remains and becomes a marker for a new home, rebuilt 2-3 generations later on the same spot, kind of restarting this cycle once again. So this is not just an innovation at the time, but also a revelation for us today by these houses deforming under use, enriched with nutrients and turned into compost heaps, these house stances physically and metaphorically sustained prehistoric life through built volume, but without the need for rigid, permanent architecture, a built investment into a place over time, not a structure. Isn't that a brilliant, innovative concept of domestic architecture in the Scottish Bronze Age, 3,500 years ago? And I think there's something for us to learn in here today on how we think about domestic house architecture. But yet, for my final example, I'll turn to more familiar grounds. And in fact, I have to admit, I picked another icon, and probably the best known prehistoric example inside and outside Scotland. Scarabray. Why do so many people love Scarabray? I think it's less so for its architectural innovation. Building into the ground then towards the sky has been done before. But it's this feeling of earthiness, warming each other in a hostile climate and an exposed landscape. Feelings maybe mirrored in today's earthship, these kind of modern, sustainable buildings sunken into the ground that leave a minimal impression on the land. And Scarabray also responds to wanting to be part of a community, living and working together in a village, something so easily read in this organic architecture. But recent research, and this time not by me, but by David Clark, suggests a different story, and I'm very grateful that David allowed me to share his ideas here with you prior to the publication. Well, his work suggests that Scarabray, surprise, is more complex, and that we need to look beyond just the architecture. The buildings we see today are not all contemporary, and although displayed as subterranean, the early houses were actually freestanding and not dug into the ground. And the last houses were occupied while midden material developed around them. And at the very end, it was piled on top of them, not gradually, but very rapidly. So as may have started as an upstanding village, houses for the living, morphs into something modeled on a chambered cairn that would have been built maybe for the dead, accessed through this long, dark passage, buried over rather than burrowing in. And if the tomb at Maze How was a house for the dead, then Scarabray becomes a tomb for the living. So would we need to bury our romantic, domestic ideas about Scarabray? Would we maybe need to reconstruct Scarabray differently? Well, let's await David's publication. But until then, I think we should think about Scarabray as more of an architectural deconstruction than a construction. So these were my three choices: Scarabray, the halfway broch, and the Middle Bronze Age roundhouses. And they all show that prehistoric architectural design was a process, never finished, and still changing, now with our research and our own innovations. Thank you.
Right then, well, I was posed with a major problem because we move from an era where we've seen the wonderful domestic remnants, the ritual monuments, the funerary monuments of the prehistoric, into an era where, apart from what are the great architectural icons, there is, for the majority of it, very, very little visible nowadays that belongs to the broad mass of the population. One of the things that I tried to grapple with when, get onto that one, so knew who I am and what I'm trying to deal with. What we need to grapple with is that the materials that are being used for much of the first half of the period that I would be covering represent a direct continuity through from what Tanja was looking at. A lot of the architectural tradition represents the continuation of prehistoric traditions through in exactly the same way. We are looking at no clean break. People just did not suddenly wake up in 600 AD and decide, I'm not prehistoric anymore, I'm all medieval now. What you're seeing is a major problem for all of us in that, the artificiality of the compartmentalization that we were presented with. Now, it's not Karen's fault, it's not anybody's fault, but we've just got to grapple with this fundamental point that we aren't looking at something that is a series of discrete breaks. It is a long, continuous process, and many of the traditions that Tanja is looking at are actually still alive and well with us nowadays, in material use and in, if you like, the temporary permanency of some buildings. So, what was I going to look at? For most of the 1,000 years within my remit, we have got no real surviving domestic architecture until you get into the urban landscapes of the very late Middle Ages. So it's a period I felt, no, I can't really look at that. The earlier period, well, we've got the Christianization of the country. We've got a lot of high sculpture. We've got some magnificent monuments in the landscape. But is that architecture in the sense of what we were being charged to have a look at? And so, probably much to the annoyance of a large number of you, I've actually really contracted my period even further than the original remit and ignored most of the first half millennium of that. And instead, I've chosen to begin with a building that really does represent something that was an ultimate slap in the face to the population of Scotland at the dawn of the 12th century. This is monumental ecclesiastical architecture of a type that had not been seen before in Scotland. Does Dunfermline Abbey represent the start of that process? Well, actually, not really. The one that really kicks it north of the Forth Clyde line is Scone Priory, Alexander I's priory there. But apart from Oliver O'Grady's excavation and geophysical evidence for that building, not one stone survives on top of another. Here, though, in David I's great nave surviving of the Church of Dunfermline, we have monumental architecture of a style that is dragging Scotland, kicking and screaming, into the modern world of the great Renaissance. In the earlier Renaissance, not that namby-pamby 16th and 17th century thing, the 12th century Renaissance, where there is the true rediscovery of the late Roman tradition. The Romanesque is coming through. And here you are getting Scotland embracing the world of continental Reformed Roman Catholicism. This is the arrival of the orders of Benedictine monks into Scotland, bringing with them the new technology that is going to transform the face of secular and ecclesiastical architecture. This is the beginning of Scotland as a recognisable state in European terms, expressed in the archaeology, in the architecture. Now, this is built for God, but it is built by a man, or on behalf of a man, who may have regarded himself very, very much as the humble sinner doing his best to bring Scotland into the light of the true experience of Christianity. But he's also a king, David I, who is acutely conscious of the power of architecture as a vehicle for the expression of political ideologies. And this is something that is really coming through very strongly as the medieval period progresses in Scotland. We are looking at something new being done with conscious purpose with architecture in Scotland, harking back to Roman imperial tradition, harking back to the more recent Carolingian imperial tradition in the continent. This is a king who is setting himself up as the ultimate power in the land beneath God, and expressed in the building that is to become the royal mausoleum, the symbol of his dynasty. Now, that building starts a trend, and we can see the transformation that it brings about in the face of the land, where churches great and small begin to spring up. Almost every community is starting to replace, in the course of the 12th century, the small, the humble, the largely timber-built landscape of the ecclesiastical life of the realm with the new statements in stone. And we can say, directly appeal to those of you who have got an ecclesiological interest, that this is the beginning of that transformation of the physical landscape in Scotland, where the church became the dominant icon of settlement and society, certainly through into at least the beginning of the 20th century. And we might want to shy away from the fact that Scotland's character is moulded absolutely by the church. And here in Ashlar, you have the beginning of that tradition in the 12th century. So there, icon number one, Dunfermline Abbey. Number two, now we've already had height being talked about by Tanja, and both Tanja and I can really empathise. Both of us are relatively short. Height matters. Certainly, you're taller than me, John. Certainly matters. My brother's 6'4". I've got a great inferiority complex about this. But there are very, very powerful things being done with height in architecture as the great statement of power, the expression of presence, and the staking of a claim. Now, Threave Castle in Galloway, just like Dunfermline Abbey, we can't claim for definite that Threave is the revival of this great tower-building tradition in medieval Scotland. There were towers long before in the medieval period. The great tower at Roxburgh Castle, for example, which we only know about from written sources. There was likely a great donjon on top of the hill there up at Edinburgh Castle. But the Wars of Independence did cause a great amount of physical damage to the landscape, to the political landscape of the kingdom. And in the 14th century, we see Scotland starting once again to adopt what was one of the great European motifs of royal and lordly power, the Great Tower. Now, those of you, that actually includes me, who was brought up on an architectural tradition based largely on the English experience, where they go for horizontality and boring low things. Scotland, traditionally, we are told, certainly if you believe the literature running all the way through from McGibbon and Ross all the way down to Cruden, these things are Scotland's unique contribution to the European lordly architecture of the later Middle Ages, which is utter rubbish. At exactly the time that this is going up, one of the greatest towers in European tradition is being built by King Jean II of France at Vincennes. And if you really want to see power writ large, the power of the French monarchy in that building is absolutely unmistakable. But here at Threave, you have got a man on the make. This is Archibald the Grim, otherwise known as Archibald the Bastard, the illegitimate son of Sir James Douglas the Good, a man with no prospect of inheriting, who is the heavy who is sent round by his master, King David II, to enforce law in Galloway, a notoriously troubled region in Scotland at that time. And he chooses to really stake his claim to physical possession of Galloway with the most powerful visual symbol that he could choose. And he chooses the Great Tower, that is the surviving dominant portion of Threave Castle. And from that, we see the whole great tradition of Scottish tower building taking off. And this is where Scottish tower building does have a unique place in the European architectural tradition. That building, Borthwick Castle, is a glory in stone. The whole thing encased in ashlar. This isn't royal, this is a relatively minor parvenu. The Lord Borthwick, in the 1430s, making his statement of arrival. And he chooses an unknown mason architect, a man who visualized that building in 3 dimensions inside his head. And it is one of the most sophisticated pieces of interior planning going. Externally, quite forbidding, powerful, but beautifully finished ashlar work. Internally, it is a complex honeycomb of passages and chambers. Separation in the early 15th century into an upstairs-downstairs, where the service and the family need never mingle. And so again, we are getting the use of a grand building to proclaim status and identity. And it then becomes the great icon, just to finish off with Craigievar in Aberdeenshire, showing where the tradition is heading into the early 17th century, taken up by a merchant, a timber merchant, who is looking to make his claim as the aspiring rising member of the Forbes family. But my third building, again, I've gone for the top end of the scale in most cases, is Linlithgow Palace. I could have gone for the great palace block at Stirling, but actually it owes so much to this building. It's a pity that Ian Campbell isn't here, because I know I'd get his vote for this building, which is one of the grandest examples of that later Renaissance, the more namby-pamby one of the 16th and 17th centuries. It's Scotland embracing this new wave of architectural expression that is coming up out of Italy. King James I, though, is a king with a great series of psychological problems. He has been a prisoner in England for 18 years. He is coming back to a kingdom where he is unknown, where royal power has been run down by his regent, his uncle, and then his cousin. And this is, in the classic tradition, the young man in a great hurry. And he is determined to express in stone the permanence and power of the Stuart dynasty. And he chooses to do so in a building where he can strut his stuff in one of the greatest physical spaces yet created in the kingdom, out with the great churches and cathedrals. This was the largest space in any royal or lordly palace complex in the kingdom at the time. And it is designed as a theatre. This is the arena for the negotiation of social interaction, to use the social anthropological parlance. It's the great hall where he would literally have been bathed in light on the dais at that far end of the hall, glittering in the eyes of his satellite nobility. He's trying to reduce them to dependence upon him. But he is also using the building to make one of the most powerful statements of his dynasty's place at the centrality of Scottish life and its position as the junction point between God and the people. In one of the most powerful first ever statements of the clear use of architecture and sculpture combined deliberately for a propaganda reason. The largest piece of monumental sculpture, the largest expression, I believe, of the royal coat of arms yet put together at that point above the great entrance to the Linlithgow Palace. And there you have the angel holding the royal crown, with two supporting angels on either side, and clouds of incense wafting around him. This is James convinced, long before his descendant James VI ever came up with the idea of the divine right of kings. This is James, King of Scots by God's grace. And of course, he ended up on the wrong end of a sharp implement only a few months later, when his subjects assassinated him for just those megalomaniac traditions. Thank you.
Good evening, folks. I have the shortest time span, but I have by far the largest number of buildings to choose from. The largest number of building types, the greatest change in building technology. So this was absolute murder to do. This list is about attempt number 6, I think, and it's required me to move from my comfort zone in order to properly cover the stuff that I have to cover. I'm not telling you what my comfort zone is at this point. I find myself questioning actually the kind of iconic building idea for this, because there'll be another way of doing this which might be, and which I could have done, a building typologies. The tenement, for example, might be something that we could have highlighted here. But I didn't. I've gone for, well, sort of 3 icons, sort of, and to bring some kind of order to it, as we were approaching Burns Day, that's how late it was before I made my final selection, I decided that I would try and see ourselves as others see us. So in other words, which Scottish buildings are recognised by people outside Scotland as innovative and groundbreaking in the context of world architecture. If this was an American or a Frenchman choosing a Scottish building, which ones would they be? Now, that's the starting point for this, but I have to say I have not pursued that consistently, because it was more interesting not to pursue it consistently. So, without further ado, building number 1 is the Royal High School of Edinburgh, a building recently in the news a lot. This is Thomas Hamilton's diploma piece for the Royal Scottish Academy. And I want you to remember this image, I'm not going to go back to it, of this great full frontal, formal, symmetrical piece of Grecian architecture. And I think there are 3 kind of overlapping aspects to this building that make it so important. The first is the kind of architectural / stylistic aspect of it. The second is the urban and kind of complementary picturesque aspect of it. In other words, the building in the city, the building in its site. And the third is a broader kind of cultural aspect to it. Externally, it's acknowledged as the major monument of the Greek revival in Scotland. More important than any other building of that crucial 1820s period, when Edinburgh was establishing itself as the supposed Athens of the North, and I'll come back to that shortly. It's important partly because it was actually finished, unlike the National Monument, which sits above it on the hill, and partly because it works so well as part of that whole ensemble of the hill, adding to the Grecian theme of it. In other words, Hamilton was very aware of what was happening on the top of the hill. So here's the school here, here's the National Monument here, and for a period, these are the 2 most important things that are happening up there. He's aware of the emerging themes of the Carlton Hill, of a kind of national Valhalla, of a kind of urban picturesque, and of this idea of a new Acropolis, that this site here, in a sense, is beginning to replace this site over here as the Acropolis of Edinburgh. And one of the things he does that's very clever in that building, in the high school building, is he has never visited Athens. He has the same kind of sources available to him as most slightly hack Greek revival architects do. That's to say Stuart and Revitt's great book. And he uses that, but he uses it in a very clever way. So he uses the Thesion portico as the main portico of the building. He uses the generic type of the stoa for the colonnades on either side. These are both things which sit below the Acropolis in Athens. In other words, they're the kind of introduction to the Parthenon that sits above. So he takes those, he combines those, and kind of makes them into a kind of propylaeum for the Parthenon sitting on the top. And it was this building, in that context, that underpinned the entire Greek revival in Scotland. It's also crucially important because of the way that it responds to the site, and this has been a major issue in the recent debates about this site as the building is up for redevelopment. It's picturesque both in relation to what one commentator at the time called a landscape painting of no despicable kind, by which he meant the actual landscape scenery, not an actual painting. In other words, it's a very picturesque site, and the building has to respond to that. But also from a more purely urban point of view. So a really important thing here is the way that it sits in the hill, and it's interesting that there's a common thread between our three papers here. There's what links all of this stuff, certainly up to this point, is both material, stone architecture, ashlar architecture, and the importance of elevation, a sense of elevation. This is a one-story building that is pretending to be a three-story building. That's how superbly it's designed, how cleverly it's been designed by Hamilton. I may get a chance to explain that afterwards if anyone wants to question me about it, but there isn't time to do that here. The other thing about this building is that it is not designed to be seen in the way that I showed it in the first slide, as that full frontal, symmetrical, classical building. This is early 19th century. Again, the phrase that's used to describe the way that a public building on this site should be sited or should be designed is on a bending alignment, not axially like the church in Charlotte Square, but on a bending alignment, so that it gradually reveals itself as you walk along the street. It's a much more dynamic, asymmetrical approach to architecture. And that's kind of the way that the picturesque works in the city, as opposed to in the countryside. So again, Hamilton, along with Nash in London, is making a crucial and important contribution to that. And then I said culturally, Athens of the North idea, which is summed up really in this. In a way, what's happening here is a kind of reflection or a summation of the golden age of Edinburgh, the Enlightenment, the immediate post-Enlightenment period in Edinburgh, a statement of confidence about the cultural, the educational, intellectual status of the city, and from Edinburgh's point of view, of the country. It's about a kind of national identity. So, for a mix of these reasons, the Greek revival took off in Scotland to a much greater extent than it did in the rest of the UK. It developed an existing classical tradition in Scotland, going back to people like William Bruce and Robert Adam and so on, changes that tradition somewhat, and it persists in Scotland for quite a long period, well into the Victorian period, but not in Edinburgh, instead in Glasgow. When Greek Thompson in Glasgow identified this Edinburgh building, the Royal High School, along with St George's Hall in Liverpool, as the two most important Greek revival buildings. And he clearly learned from it. That sense of elevation, that placing of the portico up, is something that is commonly found in his work. So that's building number one. Building number two, if we're talking about icons and how others see us, is obvious. But this is actually not my choice. But I have to talk about this building in order to set off the choice that I'm actually making. This is a building that simply can't be ignored, and it would be quite wrong and inappropriate to ignore it. And I confess I'm being inconsistent in not looking at this how others see us. Glasgow School of Art is crucially important in Scottish architecture, partly for the sheer inspirational creativity of the architect, partly for the Scottishness of an abstracted and always reinterpreted Scottishness, but always placed within a wider international context. And here it's everything from European avant-garde, the secessionist movement and so on, to Japanese structural carpentry. He uses the technologies, some of them associated with traditional tenement technology in Glasgow. Some of it, for example, the service engineering here, comes from modern shipping, from modern shipbuilding, very appropriately in Glasgow. So it's a fantastic mix. But actually bullet pointing, which is what I have here, some bullet points, isn't really the way to discuss Charles Reddy Mackintosh's work. For decades now, since really the 1930s, Mackintosh and this building is seen in an international context that makes him a pioneer of modern design, in the words of Pevner, in the book title, in fact, of Pevner, linking via people like Hoffmann and Wagner into the triumph of modernism in the 1930s. Similarly, the first great monograph on Mackintosh by Thomas Howarth talks about Mackintosh and the modern movement. And that's the context traditionally in which he's been seen. And it's a kind of reinvention of Mackintosh by writers of that generation that comes after his death. That's not the way he was seen during his life. He left Scotland shortly after this building was finished. And that didn't lead to the great success we might have expected in Scotland, or indeed anywhere else for that matter. So Mackintosh, the greatest, most famous architect of this period in Scotland, with a hugely creative and individualistic approach that ties him into the European avant-garde and the development of the modern movement, is not what I'm talking about. But he's crucial as background to what I'm talking about. It was pointed out, first of all, by David Walker 40 years ago, and then again by Gavin Stamp when he actually worked here 20 years ago, that there's something else going on in Glasgow at this time, and it's connected to Mackintosh. But in a way, it's the opposite of Mackintosh. And it had just as important, in fact, it had possibly more important implications for modern architecture. And this building is the building I'm choosing, but it's not the building itself. It could be any number of buildings by J.J. Burnett. It's what this building represents that's important. So this is an Athenaeum in what's now Nelson Mandela Place. It represents, in Mackintosh we have the creativity, modernity, individuality. In Burnett we have creativity, modernity, and order, and system, and reproducibility, and teachability, because this represents the triumph of Paris in Scottish architecture in the late 19th century, the influence of the École des Beaux-Arts in not just in Glasgow, but in the UK and in Western architecture generally. And what this is about is a method rather than a style. The style is almost always classical, but it's method. And it's also modernity in typology. Burnett covers just about everything from factories to churches to cultural buildings. I'll show you one in a minute. But also modernity in construction and materials. If any of you ever have caused to pop into Topshop, possibly unlikely in this audience, but into Topshop, through the base, the void base of a tower, that's because that is a completely steel frame building. That is the first steel frame, fully steel frame building in Scotland. And it's by J.J. Burnett. It's also, I've also chosen this because of education. Due to the context that people like Burnett had with Paris and the École des Beaux-Arts, that method of teaching became dominant in the UK in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was used in Glasgow School of Art before Mackintosh built the building, and here's a design by a promising young student of that period in the Beaux-Arts mode, by Mackintosh himself, designing the Beaux-Arts method. And it was used in the Mackintosh School of Architecture after Mackintosh had built his building. At the same time, Edinburgh College of Art taught the same method and indeed has a building that goes with that. Not a very interesting building, but a building that's Beaux-Arts nonetheless. Burnett himself had a huge impact on British architecture. And actually, if I was forced to use a single iconic building, I would have chosen this one, but it's in London. So I thought perhaps that wouldn't be allowed. This is the most prestigious commission of his generation by a Scotsman in the heart of London, in the heart of establishment London. So Burnett and his practice, along with others, developed a version of modernism that's rooted in the École des Beaux-Arts and that characterized a huge amount of modern architecture in the UK and elsewhere until the second half of the 20th century. So it is a really crucial strand of architecture that has given a huge, in the UK terms, has given a huge kind of intellectual boost in Glasgow. And that's why I've chosen not so much the Athenaeum building, but the Beaux-Arts method and its introduction into Scotland. Now, for building number 3, I have to move away from the classical tradition and slightly out of my own comfort zone. But this next building is inevitable, I'm afraid. And it is Cumbernauld town centre. Because now we're back to what the world values in Scottish architecture. And I had to have a mid or late 20th century building, and I racked my brains. I could have chosen the Scottish Parliament building, which I actually worked on. But actually, in the great scheme of things, this has had more impact than I think any other Scottish modern or modernist building. This is a fantastic image from the archive of someone who's retired from the University of Sheffield, and all these slides are now online. It even includes the Workies bus over here. Logan, the contractor who went bankrupt building this thing. So this is designed as an overspill new town for Glasgow. The designers, Wilson and particularly Copcut, were determined to make it more urban than places like East Kilbride, which they saw as great kind of sprawling suburbs. Elevation comes in here again. This is deliberately, if somewhat inconveniently, built on a long ridge, so that there's this great structure on the ridge with the houses around that, and everything leads up to this central ridge. All of the facilities, all the cultural, shopping, public kind of facilities for a town of 60 to 70,000 are in one single huge building, multi-level, 8 stories, famous for the separation of flows of pedestrian and traffic, so traffic and pedestrians are kept absolutely separate. According to Building Scotland, it's the world's first multi-level covered-in town centre, which is a slightly banal description. To Rainer Banham, the great modernist historian, it is the canonical megastructure. And that puts it at the cutting edge of architecture in the early 1960s, pulling together strands of ideas that go back to the Italian futurists, through people like Le Corbusier, and then coming together in the 60s in a lot of theoretical work to do with huge multi-level structures and visually kind of exciting structures, pooling functions together into single great developments. So the closest we have to that here would be the St. James Centre, for example. That was sort of the reaction I thought that might get. The architect, Copcut, an Edinburgh-educated architect, and he uses a lot of kind of modernist watchwords, flexibility. He envisages extension of this building along the ridge as time goes on. But he also acknowledges that it might go wrong, in which case it would have to change to something else. He talks about becoming a gigantic vending machine, a kind of gigantic drive-through, or even a factory of some kind down the line. It was hugely feted at the time that it was built. This is a very good view of one of the awards it got. This is the actual award, in reality, to scale, by the American Institute of Architects in 1967 as the International Award for Community Architecture. This was seen as the best, simply the best new town development in the world at that particular time. Of course, I think as most of us know, it's not the only award that it has won. It has also won the Pluk on the Plinth twice, 2001 and 2005. To the intense irritation of a lot of people who lived in Cumbernauld, and I will come back to that just before we finish. This is a view from about the early 1990s, by which time they had already tried to improve it by painting it magnolia, which was never a good idea, in my experience. So this is the penthouse. We're looking at the centre itself with these penthouses across the top, which by that time were empty because by this time were not acceptable to modern fire regulations by that stage. There's a great film of this in 1970, one of these unbelievably optimistic films with people living there. There's lots of industry. Everyone has a sports car. They fly gliders at the weekend. No one ever has to cross a road. I'm not quite sure why that's seen as such an important thing, but they never have to cross the road. There's a part of that film where there's a little boy in a pair of roller skates comes from his house all the way into the town centre and up these ramps. You never see the road. Up these ramps and into the shopping centre and nightclubs and restaurants and so on are all in this space here. It did extend, but Copcut was wrong about how it extended and what would happen when things started to go wrong, as things did start to go wrong. The flexibility that he saw in the 1950s and 60s isn't really quite there. And how things went wrong isn't quite matched by the architectural consequences of that. We don't build megastructures now, we build sheds. So that's how it extended, with an Asda and a B&Q and whatever else it is that comes out. Personally, I think I prefer the megastructure to the shed, but that's by the way. Now, I want to finish off by being positive and optimistic about this building, which I do think is a highly impressive piece of work, if a piece of work that's now has some serious problems. One of the things about Cumbernauld that is very positive is that actually the housing is very, very good. This housing was designed in my Department of Architecture, in George Square in the 1960s, when we had a thing called the Housing Research Unit. And the housing to this day is recognised as not all of it, but a lot of it being of a very high quality. But there's a bit more to it than that, and so I want to just finish off by a couple of images which are not Cumbernauld, but which are relevant. There's a new book out on English modernism by Elaine Harwood, which actually references Cumbernauld, although it's entirely about England, called Space, Hope and Brutalism. But that bit about hope is, I think, the most important. And that film I talked about, and a lot of other stuff from the kind of early period of Cumbernauld, is all about this brilliant, bright, hopeful new future, taking people from the slums of Glasgow, bringing them to a new place, giving them great housing, giving them these fantastic facilities, giving them jobs out in the East Dunbartonshire countryside, as it is. Now, we look at that now and we say, well, it doesn't really work. Brutalism and megastructures and design communities of this kind are not really very popular now. But it is possible for that kind of architecture to work with imagination and investment, and it has happened elsewhere. We used to think the South Bank was an appalling, atrocious place. What's happened in the South Bank in the last few years has made it one of the most interesting and vibrant parts of London. Now, of course, Cumbernauld is not London, but Sheffield kind of is Cumbernauld. This is the same period as Cumbernauld itself, 50s into the early 60s. This is a tiny fragment of a huge brutalist housing development in Sheffield, which 3 years ago almost won the Stirling Prize. So with investment, with good design, with good architecture, with good architects being involved in this, Cumbernauld also can rise from the ashes, as Parkhill has done. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank the generosity of our speakers this evening. They've given us an energetic trajectory through the path of architectural history, and I know it's a very difficult task for them. Difficult task for each one of us to try and separate out the most important buildings. But I'm sure it's given rise to a lot of questions in your minds that you would like to share with our speakers now. Can I ask you to wait till you've got the mic and to say your name when you give your question, please?
Yeah, Marianne Everett. I am interested in the Brochs, and Musa was fantastic, but I thought mainly it was a defensive situation. They build it to defend and to impress the enemy. You're saying it isn't sort of a house for everybody. I mean, what do you? Was I taught the wrong thing? That it was a defense? That it wasn't had anything to do with defense?
That's a very good and interesting question. I did my PhD on the Broch, so I've studied them for a long time and at great detail. And what I found was that it isn't actually that practical defense, that there are notions of the tower, and we've seen this ideas of height and stone and strength being built. But yeah, the more I looked at them, they are houses. And they are built to keep a community, and they're not having this competition between building taller and you're fighting each other. Because it's interesting that many of them correspond in construction, but also when they get things wrong. For example, Gurness and Midhow, which look at each other across the Einhallow Sound in Orkney, they start building it in a very ambitious construction, and it starts to deform. And then they react to stabilize the structure in a similar way. So they must have been communicating. And it's this kind of exchange, and the fact that we see structures such as Roy, which are trying to emulate this kind of design, but not quite getting there, suggests that, they are not fighting each other. They are trying to build an architecture that's more unifying. They are cooperating. And maybe you have to, if you are these kind of communities along the coast, and you are sustaining yourself, you need your neighbour at some point in these exposed landscapes. And therefore, it's maybe more our own perception of this, which perhaps comes from a medieval castle that sits at the back of our head. But those people hadn't seen a medieval castle at that time, so they wouldn't have had these associations. And it's the stone they have all around that they're using to build this. And I do think there is maybe some kind of expression of strength and look, we can do this, we can build that high. But I wouldn't necessarily see it as this kind of, fighting each other all the time. It's making an architectural statement of working together.
Can I invite some more questions for somebody over here?
Yeah, thank you very much for all the speakers. It was really, really awesome. I'm not an architect, so excuse my my innocence in this. I have a question for Mr. Lowrey about your last, the big complex kind of. Yes. How does that situate in sort of like the French and German, and especially the American trends of megalopolis and of the time?
It sort of theoretically does. There's a lot of architectural theoretical writing at this time. Not that much of it is ever on a huge scale built. You might argue South Bank is one. This as a kind of complete new build from scratch town is probably, I'm slightly out of my comfort zone here, but it's one of very few. You could argue that actually in a way this is a bad choice, because in a way it's not really going anywhere. But because it's fitting into the international ideas that are internationally current at that time, that's why I chose it. And at the time, you could hardly move for famous world architects coming over to look at this in that kind of mid-60s period. Right.
There's somebody else down here.
Sheena Gillespie. My question is also about the modern era. Did you consider the Falkirk wheel? I thought, or is that?
I did. But we could have a long discussion about this. I consider the Falkirk wheel. I considered St. Peter's Card Ross as another kind of 60s brutalist thing. I decided then to go for something that for me, as opposed to the Falkirk wheel, is a piece of urban architecture. It's about how people actually live. And I don't think that the Falkirk wheel is quite that. Fantastic though it is. So that's why I didn't go for that in the end. But of course there are a lot of things you could have said about the Falkirk wheel in terms of an engineering tradition and so on, which would have been very good. I mean, I said I had 6, but that was not untrue. I had 6. The Falkirk wheel was in one of them. St. Peter's was in another one. The only one that was constant was the Royal High School for me, because that actually is my comfort zone.
Hilary Vandor, choosing Cumbernauld, I think most people who are maybe not architects would regard it as very ugly, as we do the St. James Centre. So is it feasible to choose an area that most people would like to blow up?
Well, let me contextualize that. I used to work, I'm not an architect, I'm an architectural historian. I used to work for the Architectural Heritage Society of Scotland a long time ago. When that organisation started, it started as the Scottish Georgian Society, and it started to defend George Square. That's what its job was. At the time, one of the people who worked for the society was Patrick Nugent, who worked for Robert Matthew in the new Department of Architecture. I know about this because it's my department. Who, during the day, was working for Matthew designing George Square, and at night was working with the people who were trying to defend George Square. So, very interesting dichotomy he has. George Square now is listed. If someone tried to demolish David Hume Tower, the Architectural Heritage Society would be all over them. As indeed a few years ago they were, when Fort, the tower blocks at Fort, one of the earliest tower blocks in Edinburgh, was to be demolished. Because the issue about architectural heritage is not particularly whether it's ugly or not, it's about whether you think it's an important part of your architectural heritage or not. So, some people might have thought Archibald de Grim's house was a diamond. So that's not the question, as far as I'm concerned. I think there is, sorry, I'm moving slightly into another mode here. I think there's an unwarranted prejudice against concrete in this country. Concrete is a very good material, and I'm not a massive fan of the aesthetics of Cumbernauld itself, but I think Cumbernauld is a very, very important place, and I don't think it's any uglier than Park Hill. And Park Hill looks fantastic since renovation. So I don't see why we can have the ambition to do that with something that is internationally recognised as a great icon of modernism in the UK, not just in Scotland, but across the whole UK. It'd be a hard job, though. I don't deny that.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe invite a question for Richard here.
Don't not worry.
Yeah, I can't always have Cumbernauld.
I think John's suffering for Cumbernauld at the moment.
We knew that when he chose Cumbernauld, the rest of us didn't stand a chance.
We did. We appreciated his generosity in going for it. Do we have another question?
Karim Milbauer. I'm not sure actually who to direct this question out, so you might actually take that one on. Through observation in the current built environment and in your talks, I've noticed sort of preference or love of Scottish or even UK architecture to natural stone. And I was wondering in what way or how that is an expression of the Scottish character or the expectations Scotland has of architecture, and in what way that would reflect into the future of Scottish architecture.
Okay, thank you for that question. It's relevant to all three speakers, I would say. So maybe it's...
Would you like to start there, Richard?
Accident of survival. In the Middle Ages, timber was just as much the material, certainly through into the early 13th century, when in the areas of the greatest urban settlement by that period, you're starting to see timber shortage. And we're already turning into net importers. Even though there were large timber reserves in parts of Scotland, we're already importing from southern Scandinavia and the Baltic. Timber then starts to progress towards becoming the high status material, both for building, but also for fuel, the origins of wood to burn. But it is there. It's just that we don't tend to recognise the evidence for it. People go to, I think one of the biggest abominations that historic environment Scotland perpetrated, amongst the many wonderful things it did at Stirling Castle, was it didn't rebuild the timber galleries that overlooked the royal pleasance, which would have been very, very high status, sophisticated pieces of design. So it's just we know that these things were there. You just need to go and look at the great timber ceiling in Darnaway Castle, for example, one of the that outstrips anything that is going up anything that survives elsewhere in the kingdom. But this is a phenomenal piece of timber construction. So it is there. It just sadly, and of course there is a modern mentality that what do you build unless you're importing a Swedish kit house or something of that kind. Timber is what you build garden sheds out of. It's low status and impermanent until very recently, when it has once again come back in as well. You think the Maggie centres and things of that kind. It's iconic use of timber, and of course, down at the bottom of the hill here, the amount of timber work in the Parliament building.
Yes, fantastic timber in the Parliament. Fantastic concrete work as well.
Would you like to add anything about stone?
Well,
I understood they opened a quarry again to use the stone for the Scottish Parliament, for example.
Which quarry?
Oh, I couldn't tell you that, but I thought that they did.
They probably did, although a lot of the stone is not Scottish in the Scottish Parliament. Some of it is, but not. There's another aspect to that, which is Stone is still used, partly for contextual heritage reasons, especially here. Sometimes it's a little bit boring. Timber has more recently started to come in quite a lot more. Quite a lot of quite good stuff around the old town, where architects like Richard Murphy, for example, are very aware of exactly what you've been talking about the combination of masonry with timber outshots, and there are now references to that in quite a lot of more recent architecture. Not just in Edinburgh, but something you can easily see by walking around the old town. You begin to see that stuff coming through.
Can I invite Tanja to make a short comment on
because you asked also about the future architecture and whether timber can play a role in there. And I actually want to bring you back to the Middle Bronze Age houses that I introduced, which were timber. Because there, the fact that these can react and expand and contract, that they are dynamic because of their material of timber, that could be something that we could use for our modern way of building houses, where families are not as static as they were maybe 50 years ago, and where we need to react more to these different circumstances. And I think, yes, timber is a good analogy for this, but also advocating to look at prehistory, look at those Middle Bronze Age concepts of dynamic architecture and think how we can translate this. It's not that everybody should now live in a roundhouse again, but taking these ideas forward. And that's something that I'm working on in my current project, to see what we can do for the future by learning from the past.
And on that brilliantly positive note, I'd like to invite you to look again at the cards you were given when you came in. And we're going to invite a vote between the three different eras that we've described. We're not going to reduce it to individual building. I think that would be too provocative, but if you would like to select one of the three from prehistory, pink for 6000 AD to the Union of the Crowns, and yellow for the modern era. If I could have a show of cards as high in the air as possible, that would be great. We're voting for which era we thought was most significant, sorry.
I think the yellows
Well, I have to say the yellows are a bit thin on the ground, but we've got clusters of them in various places. And then it's almost evenly spread between medieval and Neolithic. Would my fellow speakers like to share my view?
Could the people who are holding up the yellow cards give their names, because you're going to be
You're being kicked out of society.
Yes, rounded up and eliminated.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And on that point, I'm going to ask Dr. David Caldwell, the President of the Society of Antiquaries, to give the vote of thanks.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I very much enjoyed this evening, particularly the enthusiasm and the erudition of all our speakers, and of course our chairpeople, Stephen and Karen, for guiding us through the evening. I'm an archaeologist in origin, and I was musing about what I might have picked, or how I might have approached this evening's challenge. And in my time as a student, we tended to look at buildings and monuments as being domestic or ritual. It's a very black and white way of looking at things. And it occurred to me that these lines were very much blurred in what we heard tonight. And I could very much see the ritual value of our mega building in Cumbernauld, for instance. At the same time, I was quite struck with what Tanja was telling us about the Mesolithic house at Dunbar, which you didn't explore. We sometimes just say house, domestic, without actually thinking through how these might have been used, or just how we actually lived in houses. To what extent did our ancestors always actually live in their houses, as distinct from just using them as shelters or places to keep their goods? On a day like this, it's maybe not the sort of thing you want to think about too hard, of course. And I wondered too to what extent there might have been some general themes that were coming through tonight. There was one that struck me, a desire for height. Is that something that, that marks out the way that people at this end of the island have looked at things? Is there some correlation between that and the actual physical shape of our body and our diet? It's a good PhD thesis there for some of you guys in Stirling, I would reckon, Richard. But one of the most interesting things about tonight is I don't think I'd have picked any of those buildings, actually. I'm convinced now that they've been presented to us that there's very good reasons for looking at all of them. But I would have thought of other things, and that's one of the values, I think, of having such an expert series of speakers as we've had tonight, is that they make us think, they present us with ideas that we wouldn't automatically have thought of ourselves. Possibly Skara Brae, I might have thought about. And I think one of the intriguing things that Tanja brought out about that was the way that we just shouldn't see it as a one-off, as something that was built, but something which changed its function and its appearance over a length of time. And this idea that there might well be very long-lasting trends living in circular houses, of which Skara Brae was a part. Dunfermline Abbey, well, I suppose that's a reasonably obvious one to choose, and Thrieve and perhaps Linlithgow Palace as well. Though, since I think I know a little about the medieval period, I've probably been terribly awkward and chosen other ones. But Dunfermline Abbey, I think, was a particularly good one. Not just because it's a very fine building, but it does stand for so much else in Scottish history, in dynastic terms, in terms of the development of our religion, our royal house, and architecture, the way it influenced whole movements. It was good. I would certainly never, in a month of Sundays, have chosen the Cumbernauld. But I'm very pleased that you did. And if I'd been sitting in the audience, you know what? I'd have been with you guys up there with my yellow card. It would have been too obvious for me to have voted for Skara Brae or Dunfermline Abbey. But I think I would have gone for Cumbernauld. And I think we owe you a lot, John, for putting that in our face. And the next time that I get a bus through to Glasgow, I think I'll be looking at it very, very closely. Without that tip, of course, with my background in the museum, I might have felt that I was obliged to think of Benson and Forsyth. Some of us I see in this audience used to think of Benson and Forsyth a lot, and the building of the Museum of Scotland and our part in filling it. And clearly, it is a very important building. I'm slightly concerned at times, and I think it came out in the reactions tonight, that we Scots, I think, sometimes have a very conservative attitude towards modern architecture. We expect buildings to be like the Scandic Hotel rather than concrete structures, which ought to be able to hold their head high and at the same time still reflect back a Scottish past as well as wider concerns in the world. Whatever you think of what you heard tonight, whatever your own views are on the architecture, we've had a splendid series of presentations, one which have made us think, and if nothing else, if they make you go outside and look a bit harder at some of these buildings, it will have done a great deal for us. So I ask you to thank our speakers in the usual way. As president of the Society of Antiquaries, I hope it's not inappropriate just to put in a little plug for our next meeting on the 15th of February, the Literary Forgeries of Antique Smith, which is being presented in association with the National Library of Scotland in their building on George IV Bridge. And let me just say what a pleasure it is for the Society to be back, not just holding our normal series of meetings here, but on the occasion of this evening, collaborating with our colleagues and friends in the museum. It's a very welcome experience, so good to see you all. Thank you.